Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots. I'm Katie Helper.
I'm Aaron Mate, and I'm also very happy to announce or re-announce, because we've already announced it once, but there's never enough times to celebrate the fact that we've recently passed 150,000 subscribers on YouTube. Thank you so much for making that possible.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
No thank you to the powers that be that I'm sure have been suppressing us and been keeping us under 150,000 for so long. But you, the audience, you beat the algorithmic suppression. We're very grateful to you. And to another 150 more, which I'm sure will take, 25 years due to the aforementioned algorithmic suppression. But very thankful. And to support the show, keep us going, you can go to usefulidiots.podcast.com. Keep us going and get bonus content.
Yep, like the full interview from this week, and also, of course, Thursday Throwdown, your midweek dose of media madness, where we react to media clips and laugh instead of cry.
And we also recap our media appearances on other media outlets. That's pretty much like your exclusive home for that. So if you aren't content just seeing us here broadcast this show, you want to see us talk about our appearances on other shows, tune in for the Thursday Throwdown.
Yeah, one-stop shop for all of that. Also, on this Thursday Throwdown, we go through which politicians are watching our show and which ones aren't.
That's an exclusive. That's another exclusive.
Yeah, exclusive. Yeah. You won't hear anywhere else but here.
No.
And by the way, we will be doing an extra live stream this week about the fires that are happening, because we had already booked this week and it's a very important story. We want to make sure we address it with some experts. So we will be talking to Stephen Donziger, the environmental activist and lawyer, as well as David Sirota. And that'll be at youtube.com/usefulidiots, noon EST.
All right, let's get to our 4 basic food groups. What do we have for Democrats Suck?
Okay, so for Democrats Suck, they suck so much that I'm going to do 2 Democrats Suck. Okay, so for Democrats Suck, this is actually a Democrat maybe not sucking, but kind of spilling tea on how other Democrats suck. So this is Congressman Ro Khanna of California. Now, I think we talked about this before, but that the NLRB, the National Labor Review Board, which had a Democratic majority, lost its Democratic majority. And it seemed like, the Democrats, they couldn't do anything about it. It's just because of the way the Congress was going to vote, the Senate was going to vote. There's nothing that could be done. Well, it turns out, as always, Democrats pretend that something they don't want to do is something that they can't do. So here's Ro Khanna. Due to an unforced error by Democrats, we lost the National Labor Relations Board majority 2 years earlier than expected. This is a huge setback for the hundreds of thousands of workers across the country organizing for a better contract. Let me explain. The NLRB is America's leading labor law enforcement agency. In the last 3 years, union petitions have doubled because we have a strong NLRB that supports workers who choose to form unions, ensures that corporations allow free and fair union elections, and protects union workers if big business retaliates against them. Okay, this is a little wonky, but we'll get there. The term of our previous NLRB chair, Lauren McFerrin, just expired on December 15th. She was eligible for reconfirmation alongside a Republican who'd be paired with her. This would have secured a 3-2 Democratic majority on the NLRB for the first 2 years of Trump's second term. Bernie Sanders did the right thing. He cleared her nomination on August 6th, but the Dems fumbled it. On the morning of the 11th, Senate Democrats had a chance to move McFerrin's nomination vote through, which would have led to a secondary vote to confirm. Senator Vance, Roberts, and Manchin were absent that morning, but we delayed the vote for what I'm hearing described as no reason until Vance and Manchin returned, deadlocking the vote at 49-49. We then failed to get word to Vice President Harris quickly enough to come and deliver the tie-breaking vote. In the 90 minutes that transpired, Senator Manchin returned first, swinging the vote in the other direction and ceding the NLRB to MAGA control over 2 years earlier than necessary. These procedural blunders have massive implications for the American people, who deserve better from their elected officials. American workers deserve an explanation. So seeing the Democrats fumble this suggests that at the very least, right, to be the most charitable, that means that they do not put any priority into protecting workers' rights, right? This is a guy, again, Trump is a fascist, they claim. You'd think that they'd want to protect workers from fascists, but they don't. I mean, I think it's actually probably not just fumbling and not just not prioritizing. I think maybe they just didn't want to do it. Who knows what kind of, conflicts of interest there are, right? Like Kamala Harris, who they didn't contact early enough apparently to break the vote. Her brother-in-law is a CEO at Uber, and who knows how much Uber benefits from having an NLRB run by Trump appointees. So that's why Democrats suck. That's just one example. Well, it's funny because I wanted to use this as a Democrat suck, and I can't remember if I did or I didn't, but I was on the fence because I was like, this looks like something the Democrats could have controlled, but maybe they really couldn't. Was it just a question of Manchin? And I asked some people, some like wonky people, and they were kind of like, yeah, it doesn't really look like Biden or the Democrats could have done anything about this just because the way the Senate would have voted because of Manchin. And now we learn actually Manchin and Vance weren't there. And if they had just gotten their shit together, or after they showed up, if they'd gotten Kamala Harris to show up, they could have actually, protected workers for 2 additional years at least.
This was like the one thing, or one of the few areas where you could point to Democrats and saying they're objectively better. If you look at what Biden did with the NLRB, he did appoint pro-labor people, as opposed to Trump, who appointed anti-labor people. I mean, talk to any union leader, and they'll tell you about how frustrating it was to be under Trump's National Labor Relations Board because they were so anti-union, and now they can't even protect that part of their legacy. The Democrats can't. It's and this is after an election in which working class people, for the most part, turned against Democrats and bought into Trump's promises about how he's going to bring their jobs back, just as they did in 2016. And so after all this talk we've heard, on Monday morning this week, we heard from Chuck Schumer saying we have to talk about the working class and blah, 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 blah. And we're seeing now more on MSNBC. This is about class, not about identity. Right. So then you have a chance for a concrete step you can do to help workers, and they totally fumble it. It's very characteristic. And what they can basically count on is that Trump will continue his policies from his first term, where basically he did nothing for workers. He promised them a lot, did absolutely nothing. Appointed the NLRB with, anti-union ideologues and prioritized a tax cut that favored the wealthy. I mean, so that will help out Democrats there, I think, if Trump continues his policies. But still, in the moments they have to save what's left of their legacy from Biden's era, they're abandoning it.
That's one Democrat suck, but obviously we'd be remiss if we ignored the huge disaster that is happening right now in California with the fires. And as people may know, I'm just going to do a little summary of all the terrible stuff that has happened. So at least as of Thursday morning, there's a historic and unprecedented firestorms raging through Los Angeles. And this is January, lest anyone forget. And it's being fueled by major drought conditions, pushed on by climate change, something you wouldn't know if you've been watching any of the mainstream media, coupled with extreme seasonal Santa Ana winds. There's been no rain in 8 months, and studies have proven that climate change has led to more frequent and intense fires, as we're seeing today. The fire season in California has extended year-round as a result. 3 major fires are burning simultaneously now, one in the Pacific Palisades area, Altadena, the Hearst fire close to San Fernando, and with flare-ups in Hollywood, Studio City, and other places, sending over 100,000 people into evacuation and many more under the threat of it. People have been killed. People have been injured. It's awful. And by the time this is out, there'll be even worse news. Now, firefighters initially had trouble responding to many of the fires in sufficient force. They were totally overwhelmed, and their resources were stretched thin. So you want to know why? One of the reasons their resources were stretched thin? I'll tell you why. LA Mayor Karen Bass decided to defund the LA Fire Department by $17.6 million. But you know what she did fund more? She gave the LAPD an additional $126 million. And activists had been sounding the alarm on this. And of course, she ignored it. Here's a video of Bass, who was in Ghana at the time of the fires, when the fire started. Here she is being asked about the impact of her cutting funds.
Do you owe citizens an apology for being absent while their homes were burning? Do you regret cutting the fire department budget by millions of dollars, Madam Mayor? Have you nothing to say today? Have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today? Elon Musk says that you're utterly incompetent. Are you considering your position? Madam Mayor, have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today who are dealing with this disaster?
She's literally just standing there, like looking into the distance, kind of nodding. I mean, I almost feel bad for her because it looks like she's experiencing some kind of like episode. Now, I just want to be clear that I don't think, from what I know, I don't think she knowingly left California, went to Ghana. So unless she did that, then I don't think the Ghana thing is something that she has to feel bad about. But obviously, cutting the budget has severe consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there were warnings about these winds, but certainly, Karen Bass did not foresee that there would be this catastrophic fire situation. But yeah, I mean, when you cut a budget of the fire department, you're going to leave them with less resources. And there have been reports in some areas where they don't have water, which is, I don't know, just hard to fathom. But, there's a broader point here. It's that, like, think of how much money we've spent on military conflicts abroad. In the case of Gaza, it's not even a military conflict, it's just a genocide. And so this is why I don't just want to put the blame on Karen Bass. This is like
of course.
It's a national problem where our priorities are not simply in taking care of people's needs at home. They're on being a hegemon abroad. And all the money that's been wasted on the Ukraine proxy war and on the Gaza genocide alone, I mean, these could have done so much to address all these issues that are faced here. And so, yeah, I mean, cutting the fire department budget in her city, sure, she deserves plenty of criticism for that. But I think, the people who are far bigger culprits start with President Biden on down and the bipartisan establishment that has just authorized so much money for these disasters abroad rather than taking care of and preventing disasters here.
You just made a really good point because let's take a look at this story. Now, it is from 2022, so obviously a couple of years ago, but it really demonstrates what you were just saying. LA County firefighters send extra equipment to first responders in Ukraine as war drags on.
Oh, come on. That's too on the nose. That's too on the nose.
Aaron didn't know I was going to show that. So, yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
What do we have for Republican suck?
For Republican suck, let's turn to the incoming president, Donald Trump, who has been talking about acquiring territory, not for his own personal real estate portfolio, but for the country. He wants to acquire Greenland. He wants to acquire the Panama Canal. And he's even throwing in Canada, my home country. And Republicans are getting behind Trump's call. And in fact, they're offended that anybody would dare object to Trump's call to basically steal a bunch of land from foreign countries. So here, for example, is Republican Congress member Brandon Gill of Texas.
And listen, I think that the people of Panama, I think that the people of Greenland, I think that the people of Canada, for that matter, should be honored that President Trump wants to bring these territories in under the American fold.
Okay, they don't seem honored, just to be clear, but I do want to ask you.
Yeah, they do not seem honored because they have a sense of independence, sovereignty, because they're, all sovereign nations, and the president of the United States is talking about stealing their land. But if you're a Republican in Congress, I guess you can't understand that perspective. I mean, I will say I am a little conflicted on this, to be honest with you. I grew up in Vancouver, but it is true that culturally, Canada is very saturated with American culture. I mean, like, most people probably in America don't know this, but if you live in Canada, I mean, most Canadian cities are pretty close to the border with the U.S., as opposed to in the U.S., most of the country is not close to the Canadian border, unless you're actually along the Canadian border. But Canada, it's a much smaller country. So just no matter where you are, America is pretty close by, with the exception of the northern territories, right? So Vancouver, growing up there, we're so close to Washington State that on our televisions, we would get all of the U.S. television channels. So like the local CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox affiliates, we all get. And like that's just a part of like our normal media diet. Whereas obviously if you're growing up in the US, you're not getting Canadian channels unless you're really looking for it. Right. So as a result,
a real CBC enthusiast.
100%, yes, unless you're a CBC, which actually, by the way, you should be, because the CBC in its day produced some amazing content. We're talking about Degrassi Junior High.
True.
We're talking about Degrassi High. And then we're talking about Degrassi, the Next Generation. I mean, just that alone. And we also had Much Music, which was the equivalent of MTV, which also was an incredible network, really ahead of its time. Growing up in Canada, you are really embedded with American culture. And I certainly was incredibly influenced by American culture growing up, like music, sports, entertainment, you name it. So there is a case to be made that we're already pretty integrated. But then the problem is as much as I have this, affinity for American culture, which I really do love.
Yeah.
Then there's the issue of healthcare. And do we as Canadians want your healthcare system? And absolutely not. And in fact, most Canadians, even though there's problems with the system, are very proud of the fact that we have a healthcare system in which everyone's treated equal and everybody has the right to healthcare. And so certainly, I mean, as much as like the part of me that loves like the NBA and like music that comes from the US, not knocking Canadian music, by the way, because there's some amazing Canadian musicians. But as much as, I have this affinity for US culture there, when I get to healthcare, it's like, sorry, no, we do not want to be your state.
Is there, by the way, because you're a big hip hop and rap fan, right, Aaron? Is there a Canadian hip hop and rap that to speak of? Like,
well, I mean, going back many years, the first big Canadian hip hop artist had a song that was like I think crossed over to the US was Maestro Fresh Wes, who has a song called "Let Your Backbone Slide." Ooh. Awesome song. It's a really great song. This is from like 1990. It's a great song. And then of course more recently,
like an injury though.
And then more recently, of course, you have Drake. I mean,
right, yeah.
Drake is Canadian.
Going back to Degrassi, right? Wasn't he on that show?
He was on Degrassi. Yeah. And then he's not a rapper, but he's a singer. The Weeknd is also Canadian. Right. And these are two. So that right there are two very influential figures. And then more broadly, you have Joni Mitchell, Neil Young.
I don't think I knew that about Joni Mitchell. Interesting.
Leonard Cohen, some members of the band, Bryan Adams, Sarah McLachlan, and Alanis Morissette.
Oh, that's why both Sarah McLachlan and Joni Mitchell sing that terrible, annoying song, "I Wish I Had a River." It's like a Canadian thing, maybe. Awful. I mean, the real culprit is Joni Mitchell for writing that song, but Sarah McLachlan also repeats that crime.
Right. So, I mean, Canada certainly made its mark when it comes to culture. I'm not citing it, but where I think we really shine is that we give healthcare to everybody as opposed to here. Some
good films too. Some good writers.
Fantastic writers, fantastic films. Sure. I mean, hey, there's a long list. But certainly, if Republicans are possibly curious as to why other, nationalities are not leaping at the opportunity to be annexed by the U.S., start with the fact that you have, one of the worst healthcare systems in the world. I mean, it's good for rich people. It's bad for everybody else.
Right.
And that might be a place to start if you're wondering why people might not be leaping at the opportunity to be annexed by the U.S.
Right. Even for rich people, depending on your health issues, I mean, you can lose all your money even when you're rich because certain things are just so unaffordable. But yes, in general.
All the more reason to move to Canada and all the more reason for Canada to maintain its independence and its sovereignty. And I've never felt more patriotic than when Trump called for Canada to be annexed, honestly.
It's one of those things he probably would have maybe been okay with Canada being annexed if it had come from Canadians themselves, but none of this outside intervention. You're not into regime change, Aaron. You're very consistent.
Very true.
Isn't that weird? Let's go back to these horrific fires. Now, maybe you're thinking to yourself, will any Democrat make me feel better about this? And maybe you're thinking to yourself, maybe Joe Biden will, because he did give a press conference at a firehouse in Santa Monica. Let's hear what he had to say.
Today, there's maybe still standing, I'm not sure. But the good news is, I'm a great-grandfather as of today. I was granddaughter. Baby girl, baby boy. So I remember this day for a while, the long reasons.
Okay, so there's Biden, and he's saying, it's a little hard to hear, but here's what he said. He said, I'll remember this day for a lot of reasons. Only one piece of good news. My son lives out here, and his wife. They got a notification yesterday that their home was probably burned to the ground. Today, it appears that it's still standing. But that's not all, ready? He also has other good news to announce, which is that I'm a great-grandfather as of today.
Well, the important thing is that as the country literally burns, that the Biden family continues to come closer together, starting with, of course, Biden recently pardoning his son Hunter after saying he wouldn't. And now, as LA is burning to the ground, Biden taking the opportunity to announce the newest addition to the Biden family. So, comfort for people who are struggling in these times that the Biden family continues to gel to come together after so many years of hardship. And I mean, Biden just a real. I mean, he's just a pretty clueless person. He continues to show that. He's known for his gaffes, for like blurting out the wrong thing. He's known for being, being on the decline cognitively, and he's known for just doing inappropriate things, like, sniffing the back of young women's heads and being inappropriate. And now it's just making this announcement while people's lives are being destroyed in LA.
Really beautiful. I'm glad that this day will go down in his memory for those two reasons: his son's home being spared and having a new great-grandchild. And they say the guy lacks empathy. So what do we have for Isn't That Terrible?
For Isn't That Terrible, we're going to stick with the horrible fires in LA and turn to ABC News anchor David Muir. He is on the ground covering the infernos, and he was caught in what you could maybe call a wardrobe, not malfunction, but function, that so concerned with looking good on camera that he was caught basically adjusting his fire suit with clothespins to make it as snug as possible. So let's go to the tape.
Tonight, as you can see here behind me, it's been completely wiped away. There are still flames burning from multiple.
So there it is. As he turns to the side for audio audience, you can see in the back of his jacket, his fire jacket that he's wearing, he's got clothespins, keeping it snug. And it does give him a very good fit. It looks very, very snug on him. And, fair enough. Look, he is on camera, so you could argue you don't want to look frumpy on camera. Like, if he had a suit, he wouldn't want a suit to look frumpy. So why not the same with a fire jacket? But it's just funny that, like, as people's lives are being destroyed, this is what's on the mind of a news anchor, is like making sure that their fire jacket, which they're wearing performatively, is snug.
Right. Maybe he wants to do it the justice it deserves through clothespins. I'm not sure, but yeah.
Good job to whoever applied the clothespin, because it did give him a very fit look. So certainly mission accomplished there.
I mean, what would have been totally inappropriate would have been if Too Much Moose had been wearing that. That would have been overkill.
Well, one could argue that David Muir is a Too Much Moose candidate.
Oh, maybe he is a TMM.
And honestly, let's just start a whole news network called TMM.
That's good,
where all the anchors just have Too Much Moose.
That is good, yeah.
Yeah. I've actually been watching some of the fire coverage over the last few days, and I should have made note of this. I apologize for slipping, but there's been a lot of TMM, Too Much Moose, on TV, and that's dangerous around a fire because moose is flammable. So, these heroic anchors are really risking their lives just to look good, with Too Much Moose. And those have been your 4 basic food groups. For this week's guest, we are joined by Dave Smith. He is a comedian and host of the podcast Part of the Problem. His website is comicdavesmith.com. Go there for his upcoming tour dates. Dave is also a libertarian. So this conversation will get into areas in which, progressives like us and libertarians can't agree, but also where we might differ. Dave is also Jewish and has been speaking out against the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And as someone who's a libertarian, that is unique because the libertarian movement, is adjacent sometimes. It has a crossover with the MAGA movement. So there's an interesting dynamic there. So we're going to get into that and a whole lot more. Here's our interview with Dave Smith. Dave Smith, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I want to start with this latest footage out of Washington, D.C. At the funeral for Jimmy Carter. Obama has been pictured hamming it up with Hitler. Here's a footage of Barack Obama and Donald Trump sitting next to each other at the funeral and having a nice little giggle. And there are the bushes, of course, next to them. And, there was a shot of Kamala Harris looking back and not looking very pleased at this exchange between Obama and Trump. Because, fair enough, because Democrats, their main message for a long time now was that if elected, this guy is going to be a new dictator. He's a fascist. It's the end of our democracy. And then all of a sudden he gets elected and we just had his vote certified with Kamala Harris presiding over the certification, and now he's having a nice giggle with Barack Obama.
Yeah, it's like it's the old that old great George Carlin bit. It's a big club and you ain't in it. It's like if that had to just be conveyed in a 5-second video, it couldn't be more perfect than that. And I think this is it's something that, you know, it's almost easy just to fall into sounding like a Trump supporter when you kind of talk about how all of them, you know, they all call them Hitler, but then they're good friends with them, and it does reveal the charade. But then another part of that is that it's almost like nobody actually talked about what the real issue with a Donald Trump presidency is going to be, because it would kind of indict all of them also, right? So like if you were going to talk, like I think probably we'd all agree that the worst thing about Donald Trump winning the presidency is that he's even 2 clicks to the more insane, devoted to the Israeli cause than the Biden administration was. But of course, no one's going to talk about that because that would condemn everyone in that room. But so this whole, instead, the corporate media who really wanted to get this guy, there was nothing of substance that they could go after, even though there's so many things of substance to go after Trump from any perspective, from a libertarian perspective like mine. You know, Donald Trump's, the size of government exploded under Donald Trump's watch. For anyone who wasn't a maniac during COVID, he was a disaster during the whole thing. Obviously, his foreign policy, and particularly in Yemen, in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, it's just a disaster. The problem is, if you point at any of those things, it also implicates Obama and Bush and Clinton and the whole gang. And so they're all they had was to make up stuff. And Aaron, I think you were like debatably the best reporter in the country on Russiagate. But so like all they had was to make up nonsense. You know, the democracy is on the ballot. One of the things that's really interesting too is that in all of the corporate media's like postmortems about the election, where they're going over what happened, if you listen to any of them, they're all talking about what they have to do next time. And it's like, oh wait, I thought that was the whole thing. I thought there wasn't a next time. Like, you know, they're all implicitly admitting that, like, well, in 4 years we are going to have another one of these presidential election things. And, you know, to the extent that we have democracy in America, which is all kind of an illusion anyway, that the democratic processes of America are not going anywhere. And everybody knew this the whole time.
And it's interesting because, of course, they are also coming around to solutions that Bernie Sanders has been suggesting during 2 electoral rounds that they pilloried him for. But I think now that he's not an actual presidential threat, now they're able to not only embrace some of his ideas, but also credit them to him.
Yeah, well, I mean, Bernie Sanders certainly was unacceptable to the powers that be, you know, and when he was look, I mean, Bernie Sanders had a real movement. There are not that many politicians that have a real movement. I mean, I think Donald Trump is one, Bernie Sanders is one, Barack Obama, at least in 2008, was one. But Bernie Sanders had a real movement, and the general spirit of the thing was that we are furious and against big banks and billionaires. And, right, you know, as it turns out, big banks and billionaires have a wee bit of influence over this government. And so that message was going to be unacceptable, and they would do everything they can to get rid of them. But I think now there is, at least among some parties, there's a realization that you have to have something that appeals to voters. And so like, you're like, oh, well, we did have this guy, he was appealing to voters a lot. So let's take a look at some of that messaging. But of course, they would like that messaging to come from somebody who they can, you know, rely on to not really mean it.
Right. And there's messaging and there's policy, right? So they may just want to be adopting the messaging. And as always, I mean, they never deliver on their messaging, but I guess now they're thinking of delivering or presenting a populist messaging that they can lie about, as opposed to a centrist messaging that they can. Well, I guess their centrist messaging they stick to, but they pretend to be, even the way they pretend to be populist is a little tepid. And now I think they want to pretend more enthusiastically to be populist.
There's a real look. Everybody always like kind of makes too much out of presidential elections, you know, like, and there's always these like sweeping conclusions that pundits make. This party's done and they're forever done. But in this last election, really much more than any other, I can't really think of anything that's even comparable where the Democrats simultaneously lost their propaganda apparatus and they lost their voting base. I mean, like, so, you know, and so there is a real moment here where they realize that people are fed up with the elites, and it's obviously populism in itself is not a coherent theory, and there can be good populist positions and bad populist positions. But to just argue on the face of it that the elites have not mismanaged everything in the United States of America over the last 25 years, like, what can you point to that hasn't been mismanaged? And so I do think, for better or for worse, and it's probably both, that going forward, you're going to have some type of populist message to have any shot of winning.
What do you think of the MAGA movement itself? I mean, let's say if Trump does not follow through on his promises, you know, he talked about basically helping out the average worker. He talked about changing things on foreign policy, sort of painting himself as the president of peace, being against wars. What if he doesn't follow through on that? I mean, do you think? I mean, the sort of the prevailing view of the MAGA movement from like liberals is that they're basically a cult. That no matter what Trump does, they're not going to hold him to account. You've been around MAGA spaces a little bit. I mean, what's your sense of that?
It reminds me of like how Joseph Stalin used to have all this propaganda about how bad segregation in America was. And like, it's almost, when you think about it, there's almost like two conflicting views that you have. So like at least my first impulse is to be like, Joseph Stalin, you know, like, who are you? You really care about human rights abuses or something like that? But like, okay, once you get past that hypocrisy, you like, okay, he does have a point about segregation. It's pretty messed up. You know what I mean? And so I think that when you hear it from the corporate media or from Democrats that they're like, oh, these MAGA guys are totally in a cult, the first impulse is to be like, I mean, who are you guys to call anyone in a cult? You know, I mean, like, literally, Joe Biden, one day before the debate, everybody is going, oh, it's cheap fakes and it's right-wing propaganda that he's too old to do this. And the next day, it's all accepted and we're all just worshiping Kamala Harris, and, you know, at least for a couple months there, pretending she's joy and hope. And so if anyone's guilty of cult-like behavior, it's that side is probably the worst offenders.
I call them blue anon. I call them blue anon because, you know, and that started with the believing in a conspiracy theory that Donald Trump was controlled by, conspiring with, and being blackmailed by Russia. So, hey.
Yeah, 100%. So like that totally applies. I think that's exactly right. That being said, look, there is a little bit of truth to that. And I've noticed this over the years of, you know, I ended up supporting Trump in this last election, but I've been a pretty strong critic of his for the last 8 years. And I've argued with a lot of people who it is kind of unbelievable how much there'll be a dynamic where like there'll be a Trump supporter who completely agrees with me on the policy. And then I could look at them and be like, okay, but look, Donald Trump did this, which is like the exact, you know, like just something, for example, like, okay, you think Fauci's a criminal and totally corrupt and lockdowns were wrong and all of that. Okay, well, Donald Trump's the one who kept him on the job through all of 2020. And then the excuses just come at he was tricked, he was duped, it's 4D chess. So like there is this dynamic amongst Trump supporters where he has built up a bit of a cult of personality. This is probably true for all presidential candidates. I do think there's at least a percentage, I don't know exactly what it is, but a percentage of Trump supporters who just like are going to agree with him no matter what. And they may sound really good. If Donald Trump says we don't want to fight these wars anymore, they might be like, that's right, we don't want to. But as soon as he starts moving toward a war with Iran, they're going to catch his back and say he's got to do this and he's smart and that's why this is a good war. One of the things that I'm more interested in is that Donald Trump only has one term. There's 4 years here that we got Donald Trump, and then there's a huge question mark as to like what the future of this movement's going to be. And one of the things that I think was kind of interesting about that, like the H-1B visa debate, is that it seems to me like nobody else except Donald Trump in this world gets that treatment. Elon Musk doesn't, Vivek Ramaswamy doesn't, you know, like, I just think so. Once Trump's gone, maybe there'll be like a more open conversation about some of these things. And aside from that, I mean, I really don't know. You know, it kind of depends on what Trump does and how how much people are able to convince MAGA supporters that like this really is not a good policy. And one thing I am sure of, and I do think it's better that he won than if Kamala Harris had won, but I am sure that there are going to be disappointments and bad policy decisions. And I'm sure that I'm going to be finding out what the answer to this question is in real time as I, at some point, inevitably in a few months, am arguing with MAGA people about what a mistake Donald Trump just made. Hopefully I'm not.
When you say he's the only one who gets this treatment and Vivek and Elon don't, you're saying like the treatment being unwavering support?
Yeah, I mean, well, look, even think about how intense the kind of MAGA on Twitter was going at Elon Musk and going at Vivek Ramaswamy. But Donald Trump also changed his tune on the H-1B visas, and he's not getting the same treatment. Like, he's the guy at the top, and somehow they're still blaming the people surrounding him. And if he does get it wrong, then that's evidence that he had the wrong people around him. They poisoned his mind. They gave him misinformation, whatever it is. It's like, but he just seems to, this is why they call him Teflon Don. I mean, there is something amazing. There's a quality to him that I've never seen any other human being have. My favorite example of it always was, if you guys remember this moment in the primary debates in 2016, where it was when Rand Paul, who was my guy in the race, didn't do that good. But he was still in it. And Donald Trump just started, they asked him something about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Donald Trump started railing against China's currency manipulation. And the problem with the TPP is it doesn't address China's currency manipulation, and going on and on. And then Rand Paul just raises his hand. No moderator said anything, but Rand Paul just raises his hand and he goes, shouldn't someone point out that China isn't in the TPP? And with no hesitation, not one step backward, Donald Trump just goes, Rand Paul, what are you at, like 1%? That's why you're all the way over there. And you look at it and you're like, I think he won that exchange.
Yeah.
Somehow, even though he was just completely wrong. So he's got an ability to like not let anything stick to him, and his supporters help him in that.
Yeah, I always think that something that the left gets wrong about Trump or doesn't credit him with is that his non-ideology and non-consistency and non-principledness is like his biggest weapon, his biggest get out of jail free card, because no one really cares if he flip-flops. Like, I think what people who like him like about him is that he shoots from the hip. He's like presents himself as outside the system, even though we know he hasn't drained the swamp and mostly. So no one can really get him on his hypocrisy. And another debate that I always remember is when he was debating Hillary Clinton and he brought up the super predators comment, which is racist, coded racist language. But this is a guy who, took out an ad in the Daily News calling for the return of the death penalty in response to the Central Park Five. But again, he can do that. And that's what gives him so much power, because other people are kind of hamstrung by claims of consistency. So if they go from one thing to another, then they can be called out for their hypocrisy. But Trump can't be, because his hypocrisy is almost like not hypocritical, whereas the hypocrisy of other people is hypocritical.
Yeah, man, I'm blanking on the name of this piece. Oh man, I really wish I had a better memory. But Noam Chomsky had this piece back in the day. I think it was like in the 70s. He wrote it. There's really, really interesting, where I don't know if either of you guys will remember this, but he was talking about how like it was an article about public intellectuals, and he was making the argument that like public businessmen are actually better public intellectuals than public intellectuals, which is a very, like already kind of interesting from Noam Chomsky to be making this argument. But he was kind of making the point that like, if you're a public intellectual and you got something wrong, then in order to admit that you got it wrong, you have to tear down your entire house of credibility, because that's your whole calling card, is that you get this stuff right. So if you admit you're wrong, then why should we ever listen to you again? Whereas if the reason we're listening to you is because you built great big factories and you get something wrong, you could admit you're wrong because you're still the guy who built great big factories. And so anyway, there's like an interesting dynamic to that. And I think some aspect of that like aids Donald Trump, where it's like, well, he's there because he's Donald Trump. He's the most famous rich guy ever. So he could, and then he's just always on every side of every issue. Right. So in some ways, he's always being consistent and he's always being a hypocrite, because it's like, well, even back to 2016, it's like, we're going to end the wars. We're not going to fight the wars anymore, but we're going to take the oil and we're going to get all the terrorists and we're going to torture their families. And so like, what was his position exactly on the, like, I don't know, but there is something, and I'm sure both of you guys like feel this too as I do. There's something cathartic about Donald Trump because, like, in his weird stream of conscious, I don't have a filter style, he will blurt out the truth sometimes. Right. And he's like the only guy who's ever been in the position he's in. I mean, there were like a few other guys, you know, like Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul used to tell the truth sometimes, but they didn't have like billions of dollars or weren't world famous. They didn't have, and for those reasons, didn't have real shots of winning the presidency. But Donald Trump is actually a guy who's won it twice now. And every now and then he'll just, I mean, like there's moments that I just think of in my mind, you know, when Bill O'Reilly, you know, was pinning him down on how Vladimir Putin's a killer. And he goes, yeah, we got a lot of killers too. And Bill O'Reilly's like, what are you talking about? And he goes, well, how about the war in Iraq? And he goes, well, that was a mistake. And Donald Trump goes, yeah, okay, a mistake. It's just like, oh my God, that's the greatest thing that's ever happened. It's just so amazing that someone looked Bill O'Reilly in the face, that someone looked Jeb Bush in the face and just told them the truth. And so, you know, unfortunately, that's the situation we're in. It's like a Greek tragedy or something, but that's what we get. You know, that's the best we have right now, is that sometimes he will tell the truth.
It's funny. I actually have a recurring theme that I bring out whenever it's relevant, but it's like a game you can play. Who said it, Chomsky or Trump? And you really can do that every now and then, you know, like what Trump said to Bill O'Reilly, or when Trump is like, yeah, of course we're not going to sanction Saudi Arabia for killing Khashoggi because they just bought a bunch of arms from us. Or when he said during the debate with Biden, what do you mean Israel wants to end the war? Israel doesn't want to end the war. Like, it is incredible. And, you know, he basically will make the same points as Chomsky sometimes. It's just that the moral, like, orientation is different.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. And there's a lot less reading or involved.
Oh, yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Noam Chomsky's written more books than Donald Trump has read, but still. But no, I get your point. And look, even in that, I mean, there's always been true to some degree that if you were to, you know, speaking of people who do read books and write books and things like that, look, you could look at like Pat Buchanan and Noam Chomsky, and they're going to sound very similar on a lot of foreign policy issues, or Ron Paul or someone like that. And a lot of that is because it's not really a left-right issue. Or at least you could get to that same perspective from a leftist point of view or from a right-wing point of view.
Right.
And so, you know, like Noam Chomsky's priorities might be something, you know, like egalitarianism and human rights and, you know, like the whatever the condition of the people who are the victims of a war. And Pat Buchanan's point of view might be something more of like what's in America's national interest or whatever, what's constitutional or something like that. But you could still come to the exact same conclusion that all of these things are just awful policy, both morally and practically. And so, look, there's, you know, interestingly enough, when they ran against each other for the Reform Party, I think it was in 2000, Donald Trump attacked Pat Buchanan for being a backward old racist and an isolationist and all this stuff. But Donald Trump does at least have a little bit of that kind of paleoconservative streak in him. And so you will hear that stuff come out of his mouth. But yeah, I agree with you. Oftentimes there's not that much room between what like a Chomskyite leftist might be saying and what a like Ron Paulian or Pat Buchananite right-winger might be saying.
Yeah. I want to ask you, speaking of cults, about Zionism in Israel. You are often called a self-loathing Jew, to which I say Mazel Tov. This is a trio. I guess we're not a mikveh yet. Is that the word? A minyan? Oh, a mikveh is like a ritual bath for women. This shows you what a bad Jew I am. A minyan, I think, is a certain number. A mikveh is like a bath for women. So ignore that. Okay, we're neither one of those things. Can you talk to us about your evolution politically on this issue? Like, were you raised Zionist? Were you raised anti? Were you raised non?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I was totally immersed in the pro-Israel propaganda for my entire life. And I really never knew too much about the real history or anything like that. I didn't start reading about it until much later in life. But like as a kid, I only heard the cartoonish pro-Israel point of view, which also just included a whole bunch of blatant lies. They're very, they're very good at slogans, and they all sound really nice. Like a land without people for people without land sounds like who could be against that? And so that was always just my understanding of the Israeli situation was essentially that there were, the Jews were the biggest losers of the 20th century and the 19th and 18th too. And they were totally mistreated in Europe, and so they just wanted their own place where they could live. And these Muslims next door, because they always start next door, like they were just always next to them, I guess. They're just religious fanatics, and they just really hate Jewish people, and so they're constantly sending in suicide bombers and stuff like that. And so, like, what are you going to do? And so I was born in 1983, and so this was when Ron Paul was running for president in 2008, but it was in 2007 when he was campaigning. Anyway, I guess 24 years old or 23 years old, when I saw what's been called the Ron Paul Giuliani moment, I got very interested in him, and then I just kind of got obsessed with it. And I was already during the Bush years very interested in like foreign policy and how disastrous the wars were at that point already. And you can only really study the American war machine for so long before you bump up against Israel and realize that like, oh, this is like a really big component of what's going on here. And then I was just kind of like, all right, I guess this history is a lot more complicated than I thought. I started really reading a lot about that. And I just reached the conclusion that I think any decent, honest person should reach, which is not that like, that the Arabs are 100% perfect and right, and the Jews are 100% evil and wrong or anything like that. But I think that the conclusion is that what Israel's doing to the Palestinians is just totally inexcusable. You just can't do that. You can't do this to a group of people. It's horrifically immoral. And also what I had already come in kind of knowing, because I came in from this Ron Paul, theory of blowback, is that it was like, oh, this is right at the heart of why the Muslim world is so furious at the West. And like, it just all made sense. It was like, oh, okay, once you see it, you kind of can't unsee it. And, to your point at the beginning there about, being called like a self-hating Jew or whatever. I mean, it's probably just my personality type. And I've done stand-up comedy for like 20 years now. And so I'm just kind of desensitized to these things that just has no effect on me. I don't care. I mean, it's like, I just find that kind of amusing. And it's like, oh, I mean, if that's the argument that you have, if that's the counter, then you really must be on weak ground because, I mean, whatever, I'm a Putin apologist, or I'm a terrorist lover, or a self-hating Jew, or a Nazi, or whatever you want to say. This is all, it's just so dumb, like, I don't know. What are we in the third grade? All right. Fine, go ahead. Yes, I hate myself, whatever that means. And, I mean, I guess if there are like, for the truth is that I don't hate myself. And I really actually love Jewish people and Jewish culture. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of positives of Jewish culture that still very much inform who I am as a person today. Specifically, I was never like a religious Jew. I'm I guess reformed would be what you would classify my upbringing as, quasi-atheist Jews. But I just don't. That the truth is that, it's like sometimes, like, I think accusations, if there's a little bit of truth to them, sometimes sting a little bit more. Like if you're like a little bit concerned about that, like if you're like marriage is on the rocks and someone is like, yeah, that's why your wife doesn't love you, that might be like, oh, that really stings. But like, if someone was like, oh, that's why your wife doesn't love you, I'd be like, no, I don't know.
Right.
She does. And I don't know why. It's ridiculous, but she does. And, like, so all this stuff just has no impact on me because it's just not true. Like, my beef with Israel has nothing to do with how I feel about Jewish people or how I feel about myself. I just think it's really wrong. You can't occupy a group of people since 1967 and then indiscriminately slaughter them. That's not cool. And why on earth should I be forced to fund that, especially when it's so clearly at the expense of my country and my country's interests? And again, nobody's done better work on this than you, Aaron, but look at Syria is like just the perfect example of this, where you have it like it's so black and white. You have on one side, you have al-Qaeda, the enemy of the American people. And on the other side, you had Bashar al-Assad, the enemy of the Israeli government. And who are we picking? We're picking the enemy of my country's people. It's such an outrage, you know? And so like that's just basically my view on it. I think occupations are wrong. Killing women and children is wrong. And I'm a libertarian. I don't even believe in welfare here at home, let alone that Israel ought to be our fat welfare mom and take all these billions of dollars from the US economy. It's all indefensible to me.
Jake Sullivan said it best. Al-Qaeda is on our side.
Right.
But listen, since you raise it, I mean, not that we want to get into a big debate, but why not believe in welfare? I mean, that's where see, you know, I find myself, I'm in lockstep with the libertarians on all these foreign policy issues. And I rely, you know, Scott Horton, for example, you know, I've learned so much from him on foreign policy stuff. I listened to his show. I've read his books, and I've listened to your interviews with him. So it's just so fascinating. Like, couldn't agree more for it. But then on the issue like wealth, I mean, why not provide a struggling person with maybe disabilities or children and obstacles in life, abuse, who knows? Why not provide them with some support so they can, you know, be on their feet and have the minimum, like the basics they need to survive? That's, you know.
And to hear the rest of the interview, please go to usefulidiotspodcast.com.
That was great talking to Dave Smith. Always good to hear from him. And again, his website is comicdavesmith.com.
Yeah, very interesting discussion, and it is funny, right? It's so weird how there are these political alignments where we'll disagree on lots of very, I think, important things, and then there is overlap. You know, same thing with Scott Horton, who we had on the other day. And some people are critical of that. They don't think you should have kind of like anything to do with people unless you align 100%. But we beg to differ.
Yeah, so much so that we've even offered on behalf of all progressives, because we speak on behalf of all progressives,
right,
a power sharing agreement under a future White House.
Yeah.
And libertarians, you know, the offers on the table. We will give you Secretary of State, the Pentagon, the presidency. All you got to do is give us domestic policy.
Yeah,
I think we have a deal. Let's shake on it, libertarians. Let's shake on it.
Yeah. And you'll definitely want to become Useful Idiots members if you're not already, to hear the full interview with Dave Smith, where he gets into it a little bit about Ben Shapiro. He has some interesting things to say about Ben Shapiro, some interesting things to say about Candace Owens, Jake Shields, and the politics of denunciation and how Israel has created more anti-Semitism and what should be done about it. And that's at usefulidiotspodcast.com.
All right, that's our show. Watch out for our upcoming live stream on the fires in Los Angeles. Our website, again, is usefulidiotspodcast.com. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiotspodcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at usefulidiotpod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.